How do you know what is going on in the world? Loads of people today get their news via social media. Now, I'm old-fashioned enough to read the BBC and online newspapers, but millions of us ditched all of that years ago.
New to the world.
Millions of us get our news from Facebook, X, and Instagram. Now, in the time of Jesus, there was no mainstream media. No BBC, no Guardian, no Daily Mail.
Facebook.
And actually, the news was a lot like Facebook. Exactly. People followed what their friends were saying. And news spread faster and better in ancient Israel than almost anywhere else in the world. Israel had a particularly high percentage of people who can read and write. Every year, the entire nation came together 3 times in Jerusalem for religious feasts, and they talked to each other. And the Gospels tell us lots of people heard about Jesus that way. Now, of course, on Facebook, you can read all sorts of rubbish. AI bots spew out nonsense automatically. Grumpy people sit on their own on their laptops late at night inventing malicious rumours. And so you can read all kinds of rubbish on Facebook. But in the time of Jesus, AI bots weren't invented, and the news spread from people you trusted, who you met face to face at community events. It was like a sort of better, nicer, ancient equivalent of Facebook. And so we come to verse 17, which gives the context of our passage. The report about Jesus spread through the whole of Judea and all the surrounding country. By this stage in Luke's Gospel, Jesus is really famous. There is one story which everyone in Israel is talking about. If Facebook, X, and Instagram had existed, Jesus was trending everywhere. He was the hugest influencer in the whole country. Now today, many influencers are people you can safely ignore. But Luke wants us to see that Jesus is the one man you cannot ignore. He demands a response, and we're getting to the heart of that today by thinking about these 4 points: an inquiry, evidence, eulogy, and excuses. So first of all, the inquiry. Now, who is Jesus? People at Jesus' time were wrestling with that question. They saw Jesus' amazing miracles, listened to his fantastic teaching, and said, surely this must be more than just a normal man. But beyond that, they couldn't figure out who Jesus was. Luke describes this later in his Gospel. Jesus asked Peter, who do people say that I am? Some say John the Baptist, some Elijah, some one of the prophets. People haven't got it. They could see Jesus was more than a normal person, but they couldn't figure out who he was. And this question, who is Jesus, comes down the centuries to us. SPCK, the Christian booksellers, worked with other booksellers and found that the number of Bibles being sold in Britain has tremendously increased. Amazing. 134% increase from 2019 to 2024. Thousands and thousands of young people buying Bibles and reading them. Fantastic, amazing. But yet, if we're honest, many of these people are still confused about who Jesus is. They can see that he's very special, an incredible historical moral figure who influences the foundations of society. But is Jesus more than that? Thousands of young people in Britain are asking this question. And our Muslim friends too. We go out into Ilford and people will happily agree that Jesus is a prophet. But does it make sense to say that he's only a prophet? Iran is all over the news. And in Iran, in recent years, thousands of people have been asking this question. Is Jesus just a prophet? And they have been joining churches and studying the Bible and discovering that Jesus is so much more than that. And so, John the Baptist's inquiry in verse 20 cuts to the heart of the issue. Are you the one who is to come? Or shall we look for another? In other words, are you the great king, the one who rules the whole world? Are you the great promised king? Is that you, Jesus? Now, the way that Jesus deals with this inquiry might be a bit surprising. Jesus says nothing. He says nothing. Instead, he presents evidence that he really is God's promised king. And this brings me to my second point, evidence. I used to work for Government Digital Service, which made Gov.uk and has given us lots of other cool stuff. And the chief executive, Mike Bracken, used to have a huge poster in his office that said in block capitals, "Show the thing." In other words, he was fed up of people coming in and just having boring meetings and saying stuff and producing glossy PowerPoint. And he's like, I'm fed up with all of that. Stop just giving me words. What I want is websites that actually work. Show me a thing that you have built that actually works, that is going to help the public in this country. So he had this huge poster, show the thing. And that is what Jesus decides to do here. People are so confused about who Jesus is. Jesus says, okay, I'm not going to say anything. I'm going to show you the thing. I'm going to prove who I really am. And I believe that there are three particular lines of evidence that we have here that Jesus is God's promised king. Next slide, please. So the three lines are John the Baptist, miracles, and the preaching to the poor. Now, John the Baptist certainly historically existed. Even non-Christian historians agree this. He's mentioned by Josephus, the greatest non-Christian historian of this time and place. And he's mentioned extensively in the Gospels. And John the Baptist's whole ministry was devoted to getting ready for Jesus. Now, this is one of the many things that makes the Lord Jesus Christ unique. John the Baptist was a famous guy himself, not as famous as Jesus, but still famous, one of the best known people in Israel at the time. And Jesus has this famous guy who comes just before him, whose sole job is to get ready for Jesus. And you look at other religions, you can't see any other examples of people having an amazing forerunner like this. The closest parallel we can find is maybe Elisha and Elijah in the Old Testament, but even then, there's so much more to the ministry of Elijah than just getting ready for Elisha. Jesus is basically unique in the history of the world in having an incredible forerunner like this, pointing to God's promised king. We see also the miracles. Look with me at verse 22. Go and tell John what you have seen and heard. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised up. Now the key thing is that this is lots of big miracles. They aren't the kind of thing that you could make an honest mistake about. You know, I mean, maybe if someone has a fever and just gets better faster than we're expecting, they might think, oh, you know, perhaps that was a miracle, but this isn't what's going on here. Blind people seeing, deaf people hearing, lepers being cleansed, the dead coming back to life. These are serious, huge miracles that you can't honestly get wrong. And Luke, who interviewed the eyewitnesses and wrote all this down, is a doctor. He's not easily hoodwinked about this kind of thing. And no other religion is built on this kind of evidence. We have a great number of huge miracles done before many witnesses, written down while the witnesses were still alive. No other religion is based on this kind of evidence. And then, another sign that Jesus is God's promised king is that the poor have the good news preached to them. Now, in Britain today, politicians disagree a lot.
Yeah.
Political parties say some pretty different stuff. But the one thing they all agree about is that a good government will make life better for common, ordinary people. They agree that's what a good government's for. It makes life better for common, ordinary people. In English history, we only have one king, Alfred, who we call the Great. And over 1,000 years after he died, people still remember him as the Great, because he rescued the church from great persecution and tremendously helped the poor. Everyone agrees a great king is a man who helps the poor. And by this standard, surely Jesus is the greatest king ever. In the first century, most people who followed him were ordinary poor people. His first disciples were fishermen. When the gospel came with William Carey to the Indian subcontinent, most of the converts were from poor backgrounds. Even today, it's estimated 70% of Christians in India, their families were originally from so-called scheduled castes, people at the bottom of the socio-economic structure. In India, the gospel spread powerfully among the poor. Even in Britain, the greatest religious revival in our history, the 18th century revival, had a tremendous impact on the poor. And poor people gave up drinking, became interested in the Bible, learned how to read, and so it brought transformation to people at the bottom of society. And the same is true today. According to Operation World, which is a great source for this kind of thing, there were about 100 million evangelical Christians in 1960, as compared to 700 million in 2025. So evangelicals have grown miles faster than the world population. But the church has largely stagnated in wealthy Western countries. Over those last 80 years, tens of millions of people have been gathered into the church in Africa and Latin America and parts of Asia. Even today, the poor have the good news preached to them, and the gospel spreads with explosive power among the poor. And so we have this fantastic evidence that Jesus is God's true king, with his forerunner, his miracles, and bringing good news to the poor. So, on to our next slide. So then, there's then a bit of a surprise, because we see the inquiry, we see the evidence that Jesus really is king. But then, Jesus launches a eulogy of John the Baptist. Now, a eulogy means when I make a speech saying that someone was a good guy. So often at a wedding, not a wedding, a funeral, no. Often at a funeral, someone, a relative, will stand up and say some nice words about the person who has died. And this is called a eulogy. But they don't have to be dead. If you just make a positive speech about someone, that is a eulogy. And right here, Jesus makes a eulogy about John the Baptist. And you might say, hang on a minute, isn't this gospel meant to be about Jesus? Isn't he the point? You know, the gospel's meant to be introducing us to Jesus as God's Son. So why have we suddenly switched over onto a eulogy for John the Baptist? Which we see, by the way, in verse 20, 28 and so on. Forgive me, when they leave, so verse 20, terrible line, 24 onwards, Jesus launches into this eulogy for John the Baptist. Now the thing is about Luke, that Luke doesn't just want us to understand about Jesus intellectually, he wants us to respond to Jesus in the right way. And John the Baptist was a man who was radical, passionate, and sold out for God. And so, we are given this eulogy to model how to respond to Jesus in the right way. And Jesus shows us that John was poor, a prophet, and had a purpose. So, look with me at verse 25. What did you go out into the desert to see? A reed shaken by the wind. What did you go to see? A man dressed in soft clothing. Those who are dressed in splendid clothing and live in luxury are in kings' houses. So John's lifestyle is the very opposite of luxury. And then again, verse 33, John the Baptist has come eating no bread and drinking no wine. So John, really basic lifestyle. And in fact, Jesus is the master of the understatement. Okay? So the other Gospels tell us that John ate locusts and wild honey, fasted often, and was dressed in camel's hair. So imagine meeting John one day, and you're like, "Hey John, what have you had for lunch today?" And he's like, "Actually nothing, I'm fasting." And you go and see John the next day, and you're like, "Hey John, what have you had for lunch?" And he's like, "Locusts." And so you're like, this is a pretty basic lifestyle. Nothing one day, locusts the next. Now when I was a kid, I liked going to pubs, and in those days, we had this kind of funny scratchy jumper as part of our uniform, probably in group. Anyway, I would tear around, getting really hot, playing all these cool games, and so I'd be all hot and itchy under my crazy uniform jumper. And that was okay, because I only did it once a week and I liked the games. But here we have John the Baptist wearing camel's hair all the time. And the extraordinary thing is that John's dad, Zechariah, was a priest. And a priest was a nice, well-paid job in those days. So John's grown up in a pretty nice house, eating reasonable food, wearing reasonable clothes, but he's ditched all that because he's so passionate about preaching the gospel. He just grabs whatever there is in the desert, and here he is, locusts and camel's hair. And people looked at John and they knew that this was spiritually real. They're like, what is that guy doing? What is that guy doing? Giving up everything and eating locusts and wearing camel's hair. He would only do that if he really, really passionately believes what he is saying. And so John's poverty shows that he is radical, passionate, and sold out for God. Now, you, I, may not eat locusts. We may not wear camel's hair. I don't know, I don't. But the question for us is, if you look at our lifestyles, the way we spend our time, the way we spend our money, the way we live, if you look at our lifestyles, are we radical, passionate, and sold out for God? This is why we're given the example of John. Okay? John was also a prophet. And a prophet's job was to predict the future, yes, but also to challenge people about how they live right now. And you can see this in verse 27. Behold, I send my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way. Now, preparing a way is tough work. This word way, it could be like path or track or road or something like that. And weirdly, my dad is actually an expert in preparing ways. Say he works for the local ramblers, so these guys who like kind of walking long distances and stuff, and he helps plan new footpaths. And so they have all these meetings and they talk to the road people and the planning people and the horse riding people. And they have to talk to all these people, and it is a lot of hard work to plan the footpath. And recently they actually built a new footpath, I think even this week, from the east coast to the west coast. £5.5 million to make this new footpath so that it can go through all this boggy country and people can walk all the way across the country. It is tough work preparing a way. But it was even tougher in Jesus' time, because there were no bulldozers, no JCBs. They had to do the whole thing by hand. If you were preparing a way, you'd get the spades out, you'd make the ground level, you'd clear all the obstacles out of the way. And in fact, an entire Roman legion could spend years building a way by hand. Hard work. And so John uses this as a picture of repentance. So when we welcome Jesus into our hearts, in a sense, we need to make a way for him with God's help. We need to seek to clear out the pride, the sin, the stuff that we know is wrong. We need to clear that out to make a way for the Lord. And that is tough, hard work, preparing a way. And so John the Baptist is about being radical, passionate, and sold out for God. And finally, he has this purpose, verse 30. The Pharisees and lawyers rejected the purpose of God for themselves, not being baptized by John. So John comes along and he says, folks, I've got a purpose for you. You need to get ready for God's King. You need to be radical, passionate, and sold out for God. That was John's message. That's how Luke wants us to respond. That's why he gives us this eulogy. Now you might think, wow, this is pretty amazing. I mean, Jesus is teaching, John the Baptist is teaching, all pretty amazing. Surely the people say, great, when do we start? Fantastic. But not a bit of it. On to my next slide, please. What we actually see is pathetic excuses. And the Pharisees here are so unreasonable that they're a bit like the Grinch. Have you ever seen the movie The Grinch? The Grinch is a grumpy, hairy, green character, and he just hates everything. And the Grinch says, he especially hates Christmas, and the Grinch says, hate, hate, hate. Hate, hate, hate. Double hate, entire loathing. So he's pretty grumpy, the Grinch. And the Pharisees are like this, okay? And we can see these 3 points. So look with me at verse 32. So, dance, and then in verse 32 again, dirge, and then we see Jesus and John the Baptist's diets in 33 and 34. So Jesus says, right, you look, if I play you nice, happy dance music, you don't like it. You're like, this is way too much fun. It's way too happy, don't like it, really grumpy, hate that. And Jesus says, okay then, if I play you a dirge, which means funeral music, so if I play you sad funeral music, you're like, oh, way too sad, don't like this, hate that. Okay? John the Baptist comes eating a really simple diet, very basic. One day nothing, next day locusts, really basic. They're like, man, oh man, this guy's crazy. We hate that. What's all this locust rubbish, they say. Then Jesus comes, and Jesus gets invited out to dinner parties where he spreads the good news. And they're like, hate this, his food's way too nice, and he has way too much fun at those dinner parties, hate him. And so these guys just aren't pleasing. Happy songs, hate them. Sad songs, hate them. Boring food, hate that. Nice food, hate that. They're like, guys, you're crazy, you're like the Grinch. Alright? But they just seem like comedy Grinches until we realise that we have exactly the same excuses today. So think about the dance, okay? Now, Amy, our ladies worker, loves going to a Christian festival called David's Tent, where people passionately praise Jesus. So much so that they sometimes actually dance at the front while they're praising Jesus. And they'll worship 24/7, and people will still be singing praise at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. Now, some people would hear about David's Tent, and they're like, man, oh man, you guys are way too radical, passionate, and sold out for Jesus. I can't cope with this. Like, there's too much all this dancing and stuff. Okay? But then there are other Christians who have an overwhelming sense of how bad sin is. And they mourn at their sin. More like the dirge. And there was a famous Scottish preacher called Robert and Anne who'd lived a life of sin. And then he met Jesus. And he was like, oh, can I still be forgiven? And he spent 13 hours wrestling with God in prayer. And didn't eat or sleep for 3 days. While he was mourning over his sin and wrestling with this issue. Can I be saved? And then he spent the rest of his life, basically all his free time, as a street preacher among the down and outs of Dundee. And he was so conscious of sin and people's vital need to be saved from sin. Okay? And so Robert and Anne were like the dirge, overwhelming sense of the need to mourn at sin. And people today would hear about Robert and Anne, and they'd be like, man, oh man, he's way too radical, passionate, and sold out for Jesus. This is too heavy, too serious for me. I can't cope. Don't like it. Okay? Or with the diet. Some Christians today are so passionate, rightly so, about praying that people fast so that they can better concentrate on their prayer. Other people are so passionate about spreading the good news that they are always organising dinner parties and inviting their friends to come round and chat because they're looking for the chance to talk about Jesus. And lots of people in our society would say, man oh man, these born-again people, they're way too keen, way too radical, passionate, and sold out for Jesus. We can't cope. Okay? And so the Pharisees make these crazy Grinch objections to dancing, dirges, and diet. But actually, if we are radical, passionate, and sold out for Jesus, we will face the same excuses today. Which brings me to my final slide. So we've seen then that there's this amazing question. Who is Jesus? Jesus gives loads of evidence. He gives us the example of John the Baptist to follow. But we see that actually, when people are radical, passionate, and sold out for Jesus, we will face these crazy excuses from people who just don't want to listen. And you might say, why should I bother? Like, if I'm going to be so passionate for Jesus and people won't listen, why should I bother? And there's a wonderful answer to that question in the very last verse. Yet wisdom is justified by all her children. In other words, when we preach the gospel, most people just make stupid excuses. But some people actually do listen and are converted, and the church grows. Intro was sharing with me just last week about Nepal and how, years ago there was terrible persecution in Nepal. But in recent decades, more and more growth of the church and acceptance of the gospel across the whole country. And so, what we see is that Jesus is God's promised king. He gives us loads of evidence. We should be radical, passionate, and sold out for him. And it is worth it. It is worth it, even when people make pathetic excuses, because the church is growing and wisdom is justified by all her